and it's a pleasure to be with this group today. It's extremely hot here in Virginia, so the idea of being inside and air conditioning is very appealing to me today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about water budgeting and measurement, and more specifically I'm going to talk about the new program from EPA with their WaterSense program, where they have a specification now for a single-family new home where they're looking at ways in which to make it more water efficient. And so this is a new territory for many of us in the industry, and one of the interesting things is as irrigation experts, we're suddenly being asked to become an expert in some areas that are actually beyond our expertise typically, but we seem to know and have the most information about it. And so I'm going to give you a moment to perhaps write down this website address, the epa.gov/watersense. And even though the screenshots are from their website, trying to help you find the information for the WaterSense program and their new home specification about landscaping, etc., it really is, you have to go up here and look at spaces. And I'm going to see if my pointer will work. Maybe not. How's that? There. So it's not intuitive to try and find this, but spaces, and they'll have a drop-down menu. Obviously, you want to look for new homes, and then more specifically, you're looking for this area called Breaking Ground, Technical Information. And this is where you will be able to find out more detailed information about the program requirements, etc. But I really do believe people who will study this and become familiar with it will create for themselves a new job opportunity or a little niche in being able to work with builders and landscapers and helping them understand this program that the EPA is bringing forth to try and improve water efficiency, and one of those areas is obviously in the landscape as well as the indoor. Now, go forward here. You'll have lots of different specifications, so this is one of the pages that you will see that suddenly you have lots of links with lots of information, and I will have to admit that you will need to spend some time studying because there's lots of pages of items here that you need to be familiar with to fully understand the program. More specifically, and this even changed from just the other day when I put this PowerPoint together and got it into our folks in North Carolina, they now have an additional tool here that's called the Quick Start Guide. So when you go to this page, you suddenly will have one other tool that's helpful to you, and it's called a Quick Start, that helps people walk through using their tool and their budget for the first time. And my hope today is to maybe point out some of the things that are going on there so that you can be informed and to be able to work well with your local builders and landscape contractors, or if you're a company that does both the landscaping and the irrigation combined, that you'll need to have a very coordinated effort within your own company to make this work successfully. But I believe there's new opportunities awaiting as this program unfolds. Now, we're going to look at what's called Section 4.1, and just so you know, wonder, well, what's the other sections? Well, Section 1 is just kind of gives the scope of what the WaterSense program is for their new home specification. And that Section 2 talks about the outcomes that they're looking for. And then Section 3 is quite detailed about the indoor water usage and how to improve water efficiency inside. So it talks a lot about different appliances and fixtures and what's required for them to be working correctly. But that's way beyond my expertise, so I'm going to look more at what we are familiar with. So Section 4.1 is about the landscape. And there's two options. Their preferred option, or as they call it, Option 1, is to use the water budget tool, which will be the focus of what my presentation is today. And the other option is one that sounds simple. However, I will just make you aware that it's the most expensive option, and that is to say, well, we'll just have whatever part of the landscape we have it'll be just 40% turf, and the other 60% we will do other things. But in all fairness to the builder and the homeowner and stuff like that, it's still an opportunity to try and help them customize and to have something that's really uniquely theirs, and is also probably the more affordable or more practical way to approach the landscape and still make it water efficient. So that is the purpose of the tool, is to figure out a way to have a lot of variety and creativity in the type of plant materials used, what the landscape's going to look like, so that it's not that cookie-cutter approach going down the neighborhood. A couple of the guidelines within there's obviously more, but some of the highlights I picked out here is that landscapes less than 1,000 square feet are exempt from this program. So that might be something where you might have a condo project or a townhouse project where there is very little outdoor space that gets to be landscaped. In that case, these guidelines would not apply. Slopes that are greater than 4:1. This had a lot of debate that went on and on and on, but currently the program says slopes greater than 4:1 must be vegetated, which means it could be grass, it could be other plant materials or whatever, and the catch will come when we talk about the irrigation portion of it is, well, how do you irrigate these slopes? One of the things that came out of the public debate and forums on what you do is that the soil must be mulched. So it can't be just bare soil that could easily erode and be washed into surface waters or in sewer drains and things like that. And so the idea is that it has to be a nice landscape and well maintained. Pools and spas shall have a cover. That just makes common sense to me, but it's explained in the program. And water features must recirculate the water and have beneficial use. And of course, that beneficial use has a large, broad interpretation, but essentially it allows for a lot of creativity, and the idea of recirculating the water, I think, has always been within the industry, but it has been spelled out that that's how this is to work. Now, the water budget calculator is really an Excel spreadsheet that has all the formulas already in it, and it has 3 parts. You can download it off of those resource sites that I showed you earlier from the EPA. And then part 1 determines what the landscape water allowance is, and we'll use an acronym of LWA, but I'll probably just call it the water allowance. And it helps say how much water will we have to use to maintain the landscape. And part 2 is then to try and determine how much water will this new landscape require. And then part 3 is just to really compare, does the water requirement for the proposed landscape that I want to put in, is it less than the water allowance or more than the water allowance? If it's less than the water allowance, then it would be an acceptable landscape, and that's what you would put in. If it turns out to be more, then they would say, well, that's not an efficient type of landscape, and so you need to reevaluate how much turf or what kind of plants or what kind of irrigation you're going to use in order to build the project. So here's a quick screenshot of what the water budget calculator looks like. As I said, it is an Excel spreadsheet. You will spend a little time filling in some information, so I just put in my name up here, and this becomes printable, and so this is a document that actually will be used, and the idea is that I'm answering some questions, and I have to pick out my peak watering month, and will I be using an installed irrigation system or not? And so those are some of the questions that get asked in the very beginning. Where do you get the data to answer these questions? Well, the EPA has on their website, in that list of resources that I showed earlier, what they call their data finder, their water budget data finder. I now live in Virginia, and so this is the zip code of our office, and I plug that in, and then it tells me that my peak irrigation month is June, and there's what my ET is, and this is what our rainfall is like, and that becomes the month in which I am now creating a landscape based upon this peak demand, and we will walk through that a little further. So that peak watering month is not always the same for everybody. In my case in Virginia, it was June. Some places it's July. Some places it might be May, or it could be August. So it's been predetermined by comparing the amount of ET, the water that the plants require, compared to how much Mother Nature will offer as rainfall, And when there's the biggest discrepancy between ET and rainfall, that becomes that peak irrigation month for which we build our budget and the style of our landscape. Since I'm doing this for our friends in North Carolina, I picked out 3 locations: Raleigh, North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, and Wilmington, just to kind of show you that in Raleigh and Asheville, the month of June seems to be the peak month for ET with the least amount of rainfall, whereas in Wilmington, it turns out that April is the month when you have the biggest discrepancy between ET and rainfall. And so the water budget tool is looking for that peak month where the most irrigation might be required, and then that's what's used to build it. And so when you go to fill in your water budget calculator, this is where the information comes from. I will also make a little note that that's a tool that the EPA has created, and they based it upon some models and stuff. So when you compare it to local data, it may be very close, and I have seen it where it's been high, and I've seen it where it's been low, and but yet that's the tool they want to use, and they've tried to use the same kind of equation and rationale for the whole country, and then we try to adapt it locally, but you will be using the data that they provide. Now, for this example that I made up, trying to say, here's my average lot that's being built nowadays, and I ended up with about 7,830 square feet that could be landscaped. And so that area is what's going to help me determine what's my water allowance, and then I will be looking at what will my landscape look like over that area. So the landscaped area is simply defined as lot area less the house footprint, or the permanent hardscape like our driveways, patios, and walks. And the other thing that's a little bit tricky is to also notice that the septic system, drainage fields, and public right-of-ways is not counted as part of the landscapable area, because those things require perhaps that you have grass. Or in the northern parts of the country where they do snow removal, they want grass along that curb edge, not trees and shrubs and stuff. And so there's codes and things that require certain kinds of landscape. So not to get confused, that those will have to meet local codes, but they're not counted within the water budget. And so just to keep that in mind. And this is where you're studying the requirements will help you become an expert and a genuine resource to the builders and the landscapers in your area. So I plugged in for Raleigh, North Carolina, that I had a little over 6 inches of ET, which came from the data finder. I run it through the equation, and when it does everything as it should, it says that I will have, for that peak month, I will need 20,601 gallons of water, or that's how big a bucket I have to water the landscape, if you will, for this particular situation. So that's based upon your ET, and it's based upon how big is your area. And then the way that they make it into water efficiency is, notice up here that there is a 0.70 in their equation. Essentially what they're saying is, we're going to give you 70% of the maximum ET for that month, and that's what's going to describe and define your water bucket. That's the way I like to call it. And so if you lived in Las Vegas, obviously your bucket would be a lot bigger because of the climate that's there. Or if you happen to be up in Maine where it's a lot cooler, your bucket would be a little bit smaller. But knowing and understanding the size of bucket helps you start to pick out the kind of grass or the plants that I want to use in the landscape. The next part is the landscape water requirement. This one's perhaps a little trickier to fully comprehend. It's got a complicated equation, but that's the basis by which their calculator is working. And they provide some tables that will say these are the type of coefficients that you will use to describe. So if I was putting in like medium water use shrubs, then it says that that needs about half the water that what my grass would need. And so you start figuring out, well, what kind of shrubs? And these are all really kind of locally derived, meaning that there is no master list that covers the whole United States. So if you're in North Carolina, you will have to work with your extension agents and your local universities who may have some idea that says, yes, this kind of a shrub would be a medium water use shrub compared to this one, which we would consider high water use shrub, and then this one might be a low water use shrub. So I can't even give you any names, but you're probably familiar with those. And so the idea is to say, well, these are medium water use shrubs. Now, the ironic thing is, in North Carolina, it might be a medium water use shrub, and someplace else, if I took that same shrub, it might be considered a high water use shrub. And so it really is dependent upon local use of plant material. This other table is just saying that here's the kind of irrigation system that's appropriate, so it's the most efficient for, and so with the shrubs, you might use pressure compensating drip, which is most common in our industry. For the turf grass, well, most of the time if it's a small area, I will probably use a fixed spray head. If it's a little bit bigger, I might be able to get away using rotors. And so Table 3 then also describes, well, here's the uniformity value that we will be using in the calculator, and it will use those and say that's how efficient my sprinkler is. So Andy's talk about understanding efficiency and where water can be wasted becomes really important in working this out. Now, the other part of this budget is rainfall. And so whether it's right or wrong, and there's lots of debate about how much rainfall is effective, the tool uses 25% of the rainfall. So if I had 4 inches of rainfall for the month, I could only count 1 inch as effective. And then I would have to make up the difference with irrigation for my plant material. And that's highly debated all over the country, and I think it really is unique by region. Anyway, I made this example landscape and said that I would have about 1,800 square feet of low water requiring turf, so whatever that might be in your area, usually they're warm season grasses, and that might be in the front yard. And in the backyard where I have my pets and my kids playing, I wanted a nicer quality lawn, and I wanted a high water use turf. I could have about 3,700 square feet, but it's a higher water demanding plant. And then I picked out the kind of irrigation that would be used for these different areas. I had an area of shrubbery that I use medium water use shrubs, and then I had these other areas. A non-vegetated softscape would be like the mulch that I would use in between my plants. So one of the things to remember when you're building this water budget tool and using this is that this is good on the day of inspection, that this is what the inspector is going to look at. And so if I said I had 950 square feet of shrubs, that's not the size of the whole bed. That really ought to be, here's the accumulated drip line of these new shrubs, and it's all added up to 950 square feet. Meanwhile, I have a lot of empty space in between that is a mulch, and it's not really being irrigated. And those are some of the subtleties that I'd be happy to talk to others about in more detail. I've got to move along here. Part 3 is the results. Now this is where we're looking at my water allowance was 20,601 gallons. My landscape that I designed says I was going to take 20,507 gallons. So it's slightly less than what was required, so I have an acceptable looking landscape. And out of that landscape, 71% of the area would be turf grass. So my example, I had some low water use grass, and I had some high water use grass, depending on where it was in the landscape and what I needed. I just, that's the criteria by which it'll be determined that if it's installed, the inspector comes out, he'll measure the turf footprint, he'll look at the plant materials, and if it matches this tool, which the builder has to submit copies of it to the inspector for verification, that's how it will earn its label. Now, for somebody else, I decided, well, I'll just take this area that I highlighted in yellow, and I just changed what my landscape looks like. That I wanted maybe not as much turf area, more shrub areas, but I wanted to have a pool and some other nice things in my yard. It changed things around. I did the water budget, and it actually would be less water, but it fits my lifestyle and what I wanted. even though my turf area was less, it was the landscape that I needed, and so it then likewise would be acceptable. So either one of these would qualify for the WaterSense label. And that's the thing that we need to help our people understand, is how this tool is used. The important thing to really understand is it defines the look of the landscape. And we've not even hardly talked anything about irrigation at all. It is based on the peak irrigation month. So this is when the most water is needed. That means the rest of the year, the other growing season months will use less water than that. And the plant water requirements are really based upon local determination. Whether it's a medium, high, or low water use plant is really locally derived. And so that's where you need to work. Now, the other part of this tool, and I have to hurry on here, is to talk about appropriate irrigation. One of the things to emphasize now is even if no irrigation system is installed, they understand plants still need to be watered. So even though they're not a permanent installation, you still use irrigation default values that we showed in Table 5 for part of the tool to try to describe it. And here's what they look like. I'm not going to spend much time on that. But here's some of the nuances about the irrigation system. No overhead irrigation on areas less than 4 feet wide. And that's actually pretty typical in many parts of the country already. No overhead irrigation on slopes greater than 4 to 1. And yet there's a requirement that it has to be vegetated. So I am trying to figure out, well, how do we water vegetation if I can't use overhead irrigation? And so the option is, well, you would use drip or microspray. Now, one of the things that they have put in there is they define microspray as an emission device that puts on less than a half a gallon a minute, or 30 gallons in an hour. So there are some of our nozzles that are used, some of the new nozzles that are very precision application type nozzles that actually meet that requirement. And so this one will be a little bit ongoing to look at and try and determine, exactly how will we irrigate these sloped areas where we need the vegetation, the plant material needs to be there to hold the slope in place. If it is grass, how would we water that grass? If it's not grass, but it's other kinds of ground cover, again, how will we water that? The other thing will be is that there's a minimum DU requirement for the largest turf area. And the requirement is that it'll be 0.65, which is really raising the bar for our industry of where we have been. I do think it's achievable, but it's going to take a person who really understands irrigation to do the homework like Andy showed in his presentation of understanding how water comes out of nozzles, what is the optimal spacing, understanding, its optimal pressure in order to get the best uniformity. And then all systems ought to have a rain shutoff device. Eventually, as controllers become labeled, those will be required, but currently most of the requirement is, I think the controllers most of us are using would meet their requirement as it is right now. Opportunities for those who are certified, and you're a WaterSense partner, designed or installed by a WaterSense partner. All the systems have to be audited by a WaterSense partner. That minimum DU is for the largest turf area, so you may have areas that will have less DU, but if the system's been installed the best it can be, that's acceptable. And the other thing is to post an irrigation schedule by the controller, one for the grow-in, it's a new landscape, and then what would be the schedule for maintaining that landscape after it's established. Those will be the requirements. Some obvious things is there will be leaks are not allowed. Ironic, isn't it? There should not be any runoff or direct overspray. That's just a best management practice we've always had. Sprinkler irrigation on slopes greater than 4 to 1 is not allowed, and sprinkler overhead irrigation is not allowed in areas less than 4 feet wide. But there are other ways to do irrigation in those areas, and you will just need to understand how to best execute it. So that's what the budget tool is about. It really describes the style of the landscape and how much water it potentially will use. you need to help the builder because this is brand new for them, that they will have to be involved with the landscapers more than they've ever been in helping determine an appropriate style landscape that would qualify for the WaterSense label. And local sources of information will need to be used, and over time maybe we'll get more research to verify that. But until we get to that point, we will have to use the best information available on a local basis. Opportunities for people who want to do a superior job and that you can be rewarded for your knowledge and your skill and your expertise. I think that's all I have. And I will now turn it over to Tom Barrett.